Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming to my presentation. Today, I would like to discuss wildfires in the state of California. Specifically, I analyze the administrative issue of environmental regulation seen by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which from here on out, I'll go ahead and call as Wildfire, as a mitigate wildfire within the state. Next slide, please. The report will proceed as follows. 1, I overview California wildfires. 2, I'll discuss CAL FIRE and how they mitigate wildfire risk. 3, I analyze the hurdles of environmental regulation CAL FIRE experiences when completing mitigation projects. 4, I'll discuss the impact environmental regulations had on CAL FIRE's response to the disastrous California wildfire season of 2018 and how they plan to address the issue in the future. The 5th step, I take Friedrich's work and apply it to CAL FIRE's administrational responsibilities amidst a pending lawsuit. And finally, I provide some recommendations as to how I believe CAL FIRE can better their agency within the context of the presentation's findings. Next slide, please. So California's forest land is unbeknownst to total wildfire suppression, since wildfires, both natural and man-made, have been a part of building the biodiversity unique to California for centuries. Native Americans use methods of starting fires to clear brush and vegetation from their living areas to promote greater hunting grounds and clear areas for proper agricultural settings. Next slide, please. So wildfires can be negative, however. So wildfires occurred in the last decade have been more severe in terms of impact and frequency. Wildfires negatively impact California for a number of ways. But 3 ways perhaps are most important. First, public health is at risk with increased wildfires, since average air quality declines and smoke emitted has shown traces of cancer-causing pollutants that hang in the air within the smoke. Second, socioeconomic conditions are in danger, for displacement from property loss, reforestation costs, and a loss in state revenue from declining tourism have all been reported in the aftermath of the wildfire. And lastly, biodiversity dwindles since wildfires destroy many habitats. Some species cannot adapt to the change of a fire-riddled environment, including the endangered spotted California owl. Next slide, please. So here enters CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE originated in 1905 to undertake needed wildfire mitigation in the state of California. Today, CAL FIRE performs many activities for the state and the U.S. at large, including holding the top emergency response state agency in California. They set many regulations within the state for wildfire. They train firefighters, and most importantly, perform wildfire mitigation within the state. So perhaps the most common method used to prevent wildfire is fuel reduction. So what exactly is fuel reduction? Next slide, please. So in their literature, Hisari et al. State fuel reduction is a planned manipulation of the amount, composition, and structure of the biomass within wildfire ecosystems for the purpose of modifying potential fire behavior and its effects. Practices to complete such acts include forest thinning, prescribed fire, and establishing fuel breaks. Next slide, please. Yet, completing these practices have been very tough on CAL FIRE. So, climate change has led California in the last decade to ramp up environmental regulation to combat its ill effects. One legislation notable for CAL FIRE is Assembly Bill 1504, which states environmentally friendly timberland management practices within the state. In context of wildfire mitigation, it can take long periods of time to adequately implement needed projects. So for example, fuel breaks can take an average of 2 to 5 years under current environmental regulatory systems within California. With more severe and disastrous wildfire seasons each year, their implementation rates are unacceptable, and to protect the lives of California residents and their property. Next slide, please. So to provide some context to the regulations CAL FIRE must adhere to, I demonstrate 2 regulations that impact the speed at which fuel breaks can be implemented. So firstly, CAL FIRE officials must check the database of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to confirm if an endangered animal or plant species exists within the areas a fuel break is to be constructed. And if there does exist one, CAL FIRE must implement the fuel break to ensure the species may proceed unthreatened. Oftentimes, CAL FIRE will bring a professional forester to assure, or another official, to assure the break's environmental integrity, exacerbating the time at which the fuel break may be constructed. Second, the Lake and Stream Bed Alteration Program protects many California bodies of water. This act prohibits construction of anything that would degrade the environmental surrounding a protected body of water, around the protected body of water. Fuel breaks must also comply with these standards and be approved by California Fish and Wildfire officials before construction may begin. Next slide, please. So with these examples given as to the tedious regulations that CAL FIRE must follow, I switched to the impact these regulations had in 2018. 2018 stands as California's worst recorded wildfire season in the state's history. To alleviate the effects of this season, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order N-05-19, in which asked CAL FIRE to write a report to the governor providing suggestions of wildfire mitigation projects that could immediately be implemented, along with suggestions for future ways the state could better prepare for wildfires. Next slide, please. So in the report, CAL FIRE provided 35 wildfire mitigation projects that could immediately be started. Yet they asked if environmental regulations could be suspended to implement the projects quicker. Governor Newsom obliged the request, and the mitigation projects were completed rather quickly. Of the 35 suggested, 2 were constructed just before a wildfire broke out in their respective areas. After the wildfires, there were no reports of life or property loss thanks to the mitigation projects. Without them, the impact could have led into the inhabited areas, causing great harm nearby. So what could have been done to alleviate environmental regulations in the future? Next slide, please. Before the executive order was released, CAL FIRE had already been working on a program specifically designed to implement wildfire mitigation projects, but with less environmental regulatory barriers, inhibiting efficient and rapid deployment. The program, the California Vegetation Treatment Program, or CalVTP, shortened the permitting process of environmental regulations upon wildfire mitigation, making fuel treatments faster to implement. Next slide, please. However, the CalVTP was not implemented without a hitch. Shortly after CalVTP was implemented, the nonprofit group, the Chaparral Institute, filed a lawsuit and argued the program did not uphold primary environmental protections as the program said it would. As of today, the lawsuit is still pending and awaiting further review in the California court system. Next slide, please. With this pending lawsuit, the question remains, does CAL FIRE hold an administrative responsibility to stop CalVTP since it may not protect the environment? Well, I provide an argument that it does not. Under the teachings of Friedrich, 1, public policy is always conflictual. 2, when conflict occurs, effective action is more important than total responsibility. 3, given administrational complexity and conflict, public administrational responsibility will always remain fragmented, constantly shifting with new demands placed on the administration. Next slide, please. So under this public administration framework provided by Friedrich, more immediate issues should be prioritized when conflictual. So as evidenced prior, wildfires are the more immediate public issue in this case. Again, that's debatable, but as this case is presented, it is more immediate. While environmental regulations conflict with wildfire mitigation must first proceed and then combat the conflict of environmental regulation later, as it's CAL FIRE's administrative responsibility to protect California residents from severe wildfire damage. And with each increasing year, in terms of severity, it seems to be the case that needs to be first. Next slide, please. So I offer a few recommendations as to both assure that wildfire mitigation happens and also protect the environmental regulations and the environment itself as well. First, CAL FIRE should take the issue of environmental protection seriously and totally. With the pending lawsuit, I recommend CAL FIRE officials to review their wildfire policy impacts to observe any shortfalls that may exist with CAL VTP. There could be unintentional consequences created via the CAL VTP program. So perhaps a simple solution exists. One doesn't know. They also hold, as well, a responsibility to protect the environment and cannot outright lose its responsibility with other imminent threats. So protect residents today and quickly circle back to the environment tomorrow. Next slide, please. So second, I recommend that CAL FIRE advocate for alternative, effective, and environmentally sustainable mitigation practices. Known at large throughout the wildfire mitigation community, involves the use of prescribed burning, as I mentioned earlier. It's a practice that intentionally sets the floor of a forest on fire to create a gap in viable biomass fuel for wildfires to spread. This is a practice that can be traced back to Native American forestry practices thousands of years. It's also found to be a safe and effective wildfire technique and demonstrates environmentally sustainable outcomes. However, prescribed fire is vastly underutilized in California, as Miller et al. Demonstrate. So I highly recommend looking more so into using this particular wildfire mitigation practice to combat the more severe wildfires that California is currently experiencing. Recommendation 3, next slide please. And final recommendation, I advocate for a better, holistic, and interoperable wildfire policy approach. So recently, CAL FIRE teamed up with many of the other public agencies in charge of forestry and environmental regulatory standards throughout the state. This collective has been called the Forest Climate Action Team. This team, with shared resources and human capital, should take time to consider where policy needs to change, where it could be added or even removed to protect not only California residents from wildfires, but also environmental impacts. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening. Does anybody in the audience have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So can you go back to the Cal VTP slides in the beginning? Mm-hmm. Why do you think Cal VTP failed? Was there an implementation problem? What did they miss?
So I have not reviewed the literature of both extensively, so I'm careful with any particular comments that I make. But on a brief scan of what the Cal VTP implements and environmental regulation within the state of California, there are some shortfalls. While I can't get into necessarily any particulars, it's a trade-off. If one wants to have greater environmental regulation and also the rapidity associated with wildfire mitigation, it's difficult. As I gave the example earlier, if an endangered species is in the area, they are supposed to come out with another official professional to then go and watch and observe all of the wildfire mitigation that happens. I mean, that could take weeks. You have to make sure that time schedules are appropriate. And again, in that time, there could be multiple wildfires that begin. So,
I'd like to go further into that. So, is it a federal problem or a state problem? And why has money not been allocated to help move these programs along?
It's a great question. So I did not put this specifically in the presentation, but federal-owned forest land exists more in California than the state actually owns. So it's crazy to think about, but the federal government has more jurisdiction on overall forest land mass than does CAL FIRE and the state of California. When operating together in the literature that I've reviewed, it is very difficult for them. They have to coordinate resources and then make sure that one does not overextend into the other's jurisdiction. And if both teams aren't operating together, the federal government could be doing one thing versus California doing something completely different. And so that also, outside the scope of this particular project, is something that needs to increase. So hopefully, if there is some more joint coalitions, which in 2018, then President Trump, along with Governor Gavin Newsom, did get together to discuss some increased funding for the severity of wildfire. But of course, those talks would need to be more continual. And with COVID-19 being the biggest case study currently, I had not looked into more. But hopefully with that started a little bit more of some discussion to appropriate more resources. But time will tell and we'll have to see. Thank you for your question.